He was approached by two police officers. The reason? A flimsy tip about someone suspicious. Their glances, their voices, it was all laced with judgment, with a silent, cruel prejudice. He tried to stay composed, to speak rationally, to assert his rights as any American should. But his calm only seemed to provoke them further. The remarks began. Ugly, racial, personal. They picked at the color of his skin, questioned his presence, demeaned him with every breath. To them, even the smallest pushback was defiance. In their eyes, he wasn't a professional. He was a black man who needed to be put in place. Then the worst happened. In the midst of startled gasps from onlookers, he was tackled. The cold click of handcuffs cut through the airport noise like a gunshot. A man of dignity, respect, and achievement was now being dragged like a suspect in front of travelers, cameras, and disbelief. The officers smirked proudly, certain they had just completed some kind of noble duty. But they had made a grave mistake. They had no idea who the man they just insulted and restrained really was. The consequences? They were coming, and fast. Let's begin this powerful story. It was a chilly evening in Brighton City. A commercial airliner touched down softly on runway 17L at Baystone International Airport, ending a turbulent 4-hour journey from Haverford, the capital. Among the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, Nathaniel Cross exhaled quietly. The sigh was almost unnoticeable, yet for him it marked a moment of personal relief. His unscheduled detour to a classified security forum in Oslo had stretched longer than planned, and now all he craved was a few hours of peace before returning to his high-pressure routine. He stayed seated until the seatbelt sign flicked off. As the plane came to rest at Gate D6, Nathaniel rose. In his late 50s, he still carried the posture and presence of a man shaped by decades in security and strategy. His silvering hair was meticulously cut, his features were strong, but it was his eyes, sharp and measured, that revealed his true experience. His suit, though simple, was immaculately tailored. His navy tie hung slightly loosened, the only sign of fatigue from the long-haul flight. Nathaniel carried only a slim black briefcase, inside sensitive documents, and a small travel bag. No security escort, no entourage. That was his way. For highly discreet operations or unofficial visits, traveling alone drew less attention, especially in busy environments like airports, where anonymity often meant safety. As the aircraft doors opened, Nathaniel merged into the flow of passengers exiting. Pulling his small roller bag behind him, briefcase under his arm, his gait was calm, composed. His gaze moved constantly, watching, scanning. It was second nature. Every face, every discarded item, every unusual movement registered in his mind. An instinct honed over decades. The Terminal 1 arrival area was buzzing, despite the fading daylight. Loudspeaker announcements echoed from above. The clack of rolling suitcases blended with conversations in a dozen languages. Still, Nathaniel moved with quiet confidence, edging toward the connecting flights area. No checked baggage. He never did. Too risky. Too slow. Elsewhere in the terminal, 2 officers from the Brighton Municipal Police Department were finishing up a slow patrol. Officer Dennis Crowley, a white man in his early 50s, leaned against a support column with a permanent scowl. Years on the job had worn him thin, physically and emotionally. Next to him stood Officer Luke Barrett, a wiry man in his 30s, eager but green. Crowley grumbled about low wages and long shifts, but his real bitterness stemmed from somewhere deeper. His worldview was hardened, shaped by years of suspicion and quiet bigotry. Crowley saw his badge not just as authority, but as permission. Then came the call. His shoulder-mounted radio crackled, then went silent. Instead, a message blinked on his handheld device. It was vague. A security officer somewhere had flagged a suspicious black male walking through Gate D6. Dark clothes, seemed nervous. No actual behavior noted. No real cause. Just vibes. Crowley read the alert with a half-smile creeping onto his weathered face. His eyes scanned the crowd, and there he was. Nathaniel Cross, the only black man fitting the generic description. "Hey, Barrett," Crowley nudged his partner. "Looks like our guys just clocked in." Barrett followed Crowley's gaze. He saw a composed, sharply dressed man moving calmly through the terminal. He hesitated. This man didn't look remotely threatening. If anything, he radiated calm authority. But Crowley was the senior officer, and Barrett had been trained, consciously or not, to defer. I guess he fits," Barrett mumbled. That was all Crowley needed. He straightened up, pulled down the brim of his cap, and strode toward Nathaniel with Barrett trailing behind. They were about to make a decision that would change their lives forever. Officer Dennis Crowley glanced at the report again, his smirk deepening as he spotted a lone figure emerging from the flow of passengers at Gate D6. It was Nathaniel Cross, the only black man in sight who vaguely matched the vague, racially charged description. Crowley didn't care how thin the details were. He had already made up his mind. "Barrett," he said with a dry chuckle, nudging his younger partner, "our guy just clocked in. Looks like we've got ourselves a match." There was smugness in his tone, the kind of satisfaction that came from reinforcing his own prejudices. Officer Luke Barrett followed his gaze and caught sight of Nathaniel walking with quiet confidence. He hesitated. The man looked professional, calm, even distinguished. Not at all the image of someone causing trouble. Still, Crowley's authority was unspoken but firm, and Barrett, still eager to fit in, nodded uncertainly. "Yeah, I guess he matches the description." That was all Crowley needed. He pushed off from the pillar with theatrical purpose, adjusting his cap like a cowboy before a duel. Barrett followed close behind, his posture mimicking confidence, though laced with nerves. Together, they moved in on their unsuspecting target. They stopped Nathaniel Cross so suddenly he nearly stumbled. "Sir, stop right there," Crowley barked, his voice clipped and confrontational. Nathaniel halted and turned, his expression neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance. He had seen this before, not often in recent years, but enough to recognize the sting of being judged solely by his appearance. "Is there an issue, officers?" His voice was low and steady, the measured tone of a man used to navigating intense situations without losing his composure. But to Crowley, that composure was an insult, a refusal to show fear. And that, in his twisted view, was defiance. Crowley stepped closer than necessary, his eyes scanning Nathaniel from head to toe, as though searching for a reason to justify his assumptions. The space between them was intentionally aggressive, meant to dominate. "We received a report," Crowley said flatly, "about a suspicious individual matching your description. We need to see your ID." Nathaniel remained still. His tone didn't change, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now. "May I ask what exactly this report stated? What am I suspected of?" He kept his words polite, yet precise. Legal, even. Not to intimidate, but to remind them of the boundaries they were overstepping. You do realize, he continued, that in order to detain or question a citizen, you're required to have reasonable suspicion, not just a vague profile and a hunch. That annoyed Crowley even more. He despised being corrected, especially by someone like Nathaniel. "Don't try to get smart with me," Crowley snapped, impatience dripping from every syllable. "This is an airport. We can question whoever we want. So, how about you hand over your ID, unless you've got something to hide?" His voice hardened, and his gaze turned accusatory. Nathaniel knew better than to escalate. Arguing further would only tighten the noose they were already trying to slip over his dignity. He gave a quiet sigh, reached into his coat, and calmly retrieved his wallet. From it, he pulled a sleek ID card, his New Arkland driver's license, and handed it over. He knew what would happen next. Crowley snatched it, glanced at the details, then looked back at Nathaniel with a mix of mockery and suspicion. "New Arkland, huh?" he scoffed. "What's a guy from across the country doing here in Brighton? Dressed like you're about to brief the Senate or something." His voice was laced with sarcasm and challenge. Beside him, Barrett, feeling the need to impress, chimed in. "Yeah, or maybe you're here for something else," he added awkwardly. "Tracking someone? Running a covert op? Carrying something?" The accusations were baseless, thrown out with no evidence, just a desire to validate their prejudices. They weren't protecting anyone. They were profiling. Inside Nathaniel, anger began to simmer. He had devoted his life to defending the values of law, justice, and civil rights. And now he stood here, judged, insulted, interrogated, by men who had no idea what service, honor, or restraint truly meant. Still, years of discipline kept his voice even. "I'm here on business," he said firmly. "And with all due respect, my job, my appearance, and my travel plans are none of your concern. They certainly don't justify this line of questioning." Crowley let out a nasty laugh. "Oh, I see. Business," he said, mimicking the word as if it were absurd. "Let me guess. Secret meetings, backdoor deals, the kind of stuff people like you get into." He said it slowly. "People like you," with venom tucked between the words. The meaning was clear and ugly. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. His voice dropped. "Officer," he said quietly, each word deliberate, "what you just said was not only inappropriate, it was discriminatory. I suggest you stop right now." There was no rage in his voice, no yelling, but the strength behind it was unmistakable. Nathaniel Cross had drawn a line, and the tension in the air crackled. Crowley had no idea just how badly he'd overstepped. The accusation cut through the air like a blade. "You've crossed a serious line," Nathaniel Cross said, his voice low but resolute. "Your conduct is beyond unacceptable." Being called out for racial discrimination by a black man, calm, direct, and unshaken, felt like a slap across Officer Crowley's bruised ego, his face flushed with anger. "Discriminate?" he snapped, his voice cracking into a growl. "When the hell did I ever discriminate?" His tone shifted from aggressive to downright abusive. "You're the one acting suspicious. Don't you dare stand there and preach to me. Who the hell do you think you are?" Nathaniel stood his ground. He wasn't flinching. His spine was straight, his gaze firm. "I am a citizen of this country," he stated clearly, "and I have the right to move freely without being harassed by those who wear the badge. I'm not obligated to answer your loaded, offensive questions. If you don't have probable cause to detain me, then step aside." As he made a slight movement to pass between them, Crowley lost it. "You think you can just walk away?" he bellowed. That's resisting an officer." His voice echoed through the terminal. "Barrett, grab him. He might be armed. Restrain him." The lie was bold and intentional, a justification for the violence about to follow. Officer Barrett, frozen for a moment as Nathaniel's calm eyes locked with his, faltered. But then the pressure of Crowley's order and the swelling panic overtook him. He lunged forward, aiming to grab Nathaniel's wrist. With the reflexes of someone who'd spent a lifetime on alert, Nathaniel shifted. He didn't hit back. He simply twisted away, swatting Barrett's arm aside in a motion more instinctive than aggressive. "Don't touch me," he shouted, his voice finally cracking with frustration. That single act of self-protection was all Crowley needed to declare war. "He's resisting," the senior officer shouted, charging in. Suddenly, chaos erupted. A short but violent scuffle broke out in the middle of the crowded terminal. Travelers screamed, moved away, and phones flew up into the air to record the unfolding scene. Nathaniel tried not to fight. He truly did. But he was forced to dodge, to block, to defend himself from being tackled to the ground by two men using force far beyond reason. But their strength, fueled by aggression and entitlement, overwhelmed him. His body hit the floor with a thud. His briefcase and bag tumbled beside him, personal belongings spilling across the polished tile. Barrett moved quickly, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed one of Nathaniel's arms and twisted it violently behind his back. The other followed. The metal cuffs snapped closed with a sharp clink, biting into his wrists. Pain surged up his arms. A dull, deep ache settled in his shoulders. But it wasn't the physical pain that broke him. It was the injustice, the pure, searing humiliation of being treated like a criminal in public, for doing nothing but standing his ground. Crowley stood over him, breathing heavily. There was no guilt in his face, only pride. A cruel, twisted sense of accomplishment. "See?" he said with a sick grin. "Told you he was one of those stubborn, arrogant types. Let's see how civil he sounds at the precinct." He bent over, scooped up Nathaniel's ID card where it had fallen, and waved it mockingly in front of his face. Well, he sneered, "Mr. Cross from New Arkland. Let's see if your calm attitude holds up in a holding cell." Nathaniel clenched his jaw, trying to push down a wave of fury and pain. He shut his eyes for a second, took a long, slow breath. This wasn't over. This wasn't where the story ended. He knew that much. Barrett and Crowley each grabbed an arm, hoisting him roughly to his feet. His tailored jacket was torn at the shoulder, his pants stained at the knee. Yet he stood tall, hands cuffed, suit wrinkled, jaw set. His eyes, when they opened, were ice. They pierced straight through the men before him. But Crowley, drunk on dominance, wasn't finished. He stepped in close, voice dripping with malice. "All right, Mr. Cross," he said, twisting the name in his mouth like poison. "Still feeling smart? Still want to lecture me about rights and laws? Who do you think you are to talk back to us like that?" It wasn't a question. It was a threat dressed as arrogance. And yet Nathaniel's voice was steady, calm. Even now, with his wrists bruised and dignity in shreds, he refused to waver. His words rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to silence the crowd. "You'll find out." The murmuring crowd leaned in, their phones held high, their eyes wide. "I'm Nathaniel Cross." The statement was simple, direct, without apology, without fear. It cut through the tension like a knife through fabric. Officer Crowley's smirk lingered for a heartbeat longer. Then he scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "Yeah, I know who you are." "So what?" That name doesn't mean anything here. You're just another loudmouth." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the insult. His eyes remained locked on Crowley's, cold, piercing, unyielding. Then he spoke again. This time, each word landed with the weight of a gavel. "Director." A pause. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The last three words dropped into the air like thunder. Silence rippled outward. The chatter of the terminal vanished. Even the overhead announcements seemed to mute themselves. Crowley froze, his face drained of color, the red flush of arrogance replaced by a bone-white pallor. The sneer on his lips melted. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Just a sputtering breath as sweat broke across his brow. You said, what?" he stammered finally, but the words were barely audible. "Director of the FBI." The truth echoed in his mind like a siren. Crowley stumbled back a step, as though hit by a gust of wind. He stared at Nathaniel, handcuffed, bruised, but suddenly larger than life, suddenly untouchable. Barrett, younger and less experienced, reacted even worse. His grip on Nathaniel's arms slackened immediately. He looked from Crowley to Nathaniel, then down at the handcuffs in disbelief. His face went pale. His mouth hung open. "No," he whispered. "No. This can't be real. It can't be." His legs began to shake. The transformation in both officers was instant. Arrogance dissolving into terror, their bravado replaced by the grim realization of the storm they had just summoned on themselves. Though the crowd couldn't hear every word, they felt the shift. Dozens of phones were pointed at them, recording the unraveling in real time. Crowley was the first to move, driven by a raw survival instinct. All thoughts of pride, power, and procedure vanished. He rushed toward Nathaniel, practically falling to his knees. "Director! Sir! Oh my God, please, please forgive us," he cried, his voice panicked and trembling. "It's a terrible mistake, a horrible misunderstanding. We didn't know. We swear we didn't know who you were." He turned to Barrett, whose eyes were still wide in disbelief. "Barrett, for God's sake, what are you doing? Get those cuffs off. Now. Do you want to go to prison? Is that what you want?" Barrett jolted into motion like someone had shocked him. He fumbled with the keys at his belt, but his hands were shaking so violently that they slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. He dropped to his knees, scrambling, heart pounding. Precious seconds passed in breathless silence. Finally, he unlocked the cuffs with a click that seemed louder than it should have been. Nathaniel's wrists were red and bruised, marked by the tightness of the restraints. He didn't speak. He didn't lash out. He just rubbed his wrists slowly, deliberately, watching the two men unravel in front of him. I'm so sorry," Crowley stammered again, his voice cracking, his composure shattered. "We were just doing our jobs. The report, it was vague. We never meant—" His voice trailed off, breaking under the weight of his own guilt. "Please, Director Cross," Barrett said, his eyes wide with fear, "please don't let this ruin us. We have families. We made a mistake. We weren't thinking." Nathaniel still said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than rage, colder than any threat. It was the silence of a man with power, truth, and justice on his side. He stared at them, not with pity, not with mercy, but with the quiet fury of someone who had endured enough. That silence, more than anything, was what truly terrified them. And the storm was just beginning. The panic in Barrett's eyes, the cold silence from Nathaniel Cross, and then, cutting through it all like a knife, came a deep, firm voice from the crowd. What's going on here?" A man in a dark patrol uniform stepped into the clearing. Lieutenant Frank Mercer, the officer on duty at Baystone International, moved quickly toward the scene. In his early 40s, tall and composed, Mercer carried an air of seriousness that silenced those around him. Two uniformed officers followed closely behind, alert and ready. He had likely picked up the disturbance over the radio, or perhaps from one of the dozens of passengers who had just witnessed the shocking confrontation. Whatever the case, his instincts told him something was very wrong. Mercer's eyes swept the scene. A well-dressed black man, wrist bruised, suit disheveled, stood in front of two of his officers, Crowley and Barrett, who now looked like they'd seen a ghost. Their hands trembled. Sweat clung to their brows. Mercer didn't recognize the man right away, but he knew from their expressions that they'd crossed a serious line. Crowley, Barrett. At attention, Mercer barked, his voice sharp and unwavering. "Explain yourselves. Now." Both men jerked upright, trying to appear composed, but fear was written all over their faces. Crowley stuttered, pointing vaguely at the report, blaming confusion and a misunderstanding. Barrett nodded, unable to form coherent words. Mercer didn't buy it. He turned toward the man standing silently before them. "Sir," Mercer began, his tone now more respectful, "I'm Lieutenant Frank Mercer, in charge of security operations for this terminal. It appears there's been an incident. Can you please tell me what happened?" Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low and composed, yet loaded with gravity. "Lieutenant Mercer," he said slowly, "my name is Nathaniel Cross." He allowed a pause. "I was approached by these two officers on the basis of a vague report. They interrogated me with racially charged, unprovoked questions. When I asked for justification, they accused me of resisting. They used unnecessary force, and they placed me in handcuffs." Mercer's expression tightened. Nathaniel continued without raising his voice. "Their conduct was not only a breach of professionalism, it was a violation of my civil rights." Mercer nodded slightly, taking in every word. The name Nathaniel Cross rang faintly familiar now, but it hadn't clicked yet. Then Nathaniel looked Mercer directly in the eye. "And just so we're clear," he added, with the quiet power of someone who knew the weight of truth, "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words hit Mercer like a sledgehammer. For a moment, his mind froze. Then it all fell into place. He had heard the name, seen the man's photo in briefings, but never in person, until now. And now he understood why Crowley and Barrett looked like men awaiting a sentence. Mercer moved quickly. His professionalism returned in full force. "Officers Crowley and Barrett," he said firmly, "you are to immediately surrender your service weapons, badges, and radios." The two men blinked in disbelief, but didn't argue. "You are hereby suspended indefinitely, pending an internal investigation. These officers will escort you to the security office." He gestured to the two silent officers behind him, who stepped forward without hesitation. Crowley and Barrett didn't resist. They handed over their gear with trembling hands, then turned slowly and followed the escorts out of the terminal, watched by passengers, bystanders, and dozens of recording phones. When they were gone, Mercer turned back to Nathaniel. His tone shifted again, now solemn, sincere. "Director Cross," he said, on behalf of the Brighton Municipal Police Department, "I want to offer my deepest apologies. What happened here today was inexcusable. It does not reflect the standards we strive for. I assure you This incident will be treated with the utmost seriousness and transparency." Nathaniel gave a slight nod. His face, however, remained cold and unreadable. "Lieutenant," he replied, "I appreciate your swift response, but I expect this entire situation to be officially documented, starting now. And, most importantly, I'm requesting the full, unedited video and audio recordings from both officers' body cameras to be preserved immediately. That footage will be crucial." "You have my word, Director," Mercer said. "We'll cooperate fully with any investigation, federal or otherwise, and they would need to, because what had happened in that terminal was no longer just a departmental mistake. It was a flashpoint, and word was already spreading. By nightfall, the incident was on the desks of the city's police commissioner, the mayor of Brighton, and senior officials at the Department of Justice. And at FBI headquarters in Haverford, the name Nathaniel Cross echoed with urgency. This wasn't going away. The reckoning had begun. The investigation launched by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, in coordination with the FBI, moved quickly. Once the unedited footage from the body cameras of Officers Crowley and Barrett was reviewed, there was no denying what had taken place at Baystone International. The video captured everything, from the flimsy, racially coded suspicious person report, to Crowley's derogatory remarks, to Barrett's willingness to follow his partner's lead into excessive force. And most damning of all, the visible fear on their faces when they learned who they had just assaulted. The evidence was undeniable. Digging deeper, investigators began examining both officers' personnel files. Unsurprisingly, Crowley had a long history of complaints, allegations of excessive force, inappropriate conduct, and repeated reports of racially biased behavior. Yet, for years, his infractions had either been brushed aside or given weak disciplinary responses. Barrett, though not as overtly problematic, had a record of something equally dangerous: passive compliance. He followed orders without question, even when they veered into misconduct. He had shown, again and again, that his loyalty to hierarchy outweighed his sense of judgment. But this time, the story had gone national. What began as a single wrongful stop turned into a full-scale review of practices within the Brighton Police Department. Investigators wanted to know, were these isolated incidents or symptoms of a wider rot? In the process, Director Nathaniel Cross's case became more than just personal. It became a spotlight on systemic injustice. His status had inadvertently made him the catalyst for long overdue accountability. Eventually, both Crowley and Barrett were formally terminated for gross misconduct, abuse of power, and violations of civil rights. But the reckoning didn't end with their dismissal. Given the weight of the evidence, including the body cam footage and Cross's testimony, the U.S. Department of Justice brought formal charges under Title 18, U.S. Code Barv 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. It's one of the most serious federal statutes available to prosecute law enforcement officers who misuse their authority to violate constitutional protections. In addition to the federal charges, both men faced state-level indictments in Illinois for assault, unlawful detention, and civil rights violations. As the case gained media attention, public interest skyrocketed. National news outlets covered the story closely. Commentators debated the deeper meaning. Was this justice finally being served, or just one rare exception enabled only because the victim held power? The trial was set in the Federal District Court of Northern Illinois, and from the first day, the courtroom was tense. Crowley and Barrett, now former officers, sat at the defense table with slumped shoulders. They looked years older, hollow-eyed and nervous. No longer the enforcers of the law, they were now the ones under its weight. Across from them, government attorneys laid out their case with precision. They showed that Crowley had acted not out of concern for safety, but from racial bias and a desire to exert control. They showed Barrett's failure to de-escalate or question what was clearly wrong. The footage was played frame by frame. Each insult, each twist of the cuffs, each moment of fear captured with brutal clarity. When Nathaniel Cross took the stand, the room quieted. He wore a simple, formal suit. His tone was calm, but every word carried weight. He described the incident not as a personal tragedy, but as a reflection of something deeper and more dangerous, the normalization of prejudice within institutions that promise fairness. He didn't speak with bitterness. He didn't ask for vengeance. He spoke for truth. And it was that clarity that seemed to settle over the courtroom like a truth too big to ignore. The defense tried to plead their case. They said the officers were under stress, that they misread a vague report, that they hadn't known who they were dealing with. They even attempted to frame the racial comments as heat-of-the-moment mistakes, not signs of systemic prejudice. But the jury wasn't buying it. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jurors returned. They filed in, one by one, their expressions grave. The foreperson stood, holding the sheet that would decide the fate of the two men who once wore badges. For the defendant, Dennis Crowley, on the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. For the charge of assault in the third degree, guilty. For the defendant, Luke Barrett, guilty on all counts. Each word fell like a hammer, final, unforgiving. Crowley bowed his head, shoulders shaking. Barrett closed his eyes as tears slid silently down his cheeks. The reality of their actions and their consequences had finally caught up with them. Justice had spoken, and this time it was loud enough for the whole nation to hear. Tears streamed down Barrett's face, his shoulders trembling. The faint hope for mercy shattered with the slam of the gavel. A few weeks later, the sentencing hearing was held. The courtroom was hushed as the federal judge took her seat. Her voice, firm but composed, echoed through the chamber. She reminded everyone of the weight carried by the badge, how law enforcement officers swear to protect, to serve, to uphold justice, not weaponize it. When that power is abused, she said, locking eyes with Crowley and Barrett, it does more than harm one victim. It fractures the trust of an entire nation. She didn't soften her words. Racial bias is not merely a personal failing. It's a corrosive force that undermines the very core of our justice system, and when those in power act on it, they do more damage than they can possibly comprehend. The courtroom was still as she delivered her final ruling. Dennis Crowley and Luke Barrett were sentenced to 6 years each in federal prison. The sentence was harsh and intentional. A message sent not just to the two former officers, but to departments, cities, and institutions across the country. Racism in uniform will not be tolerated. Not anymore. As the verdict was read, Crowley hung his head. His once proud posture had collapsed under the crushing weight of justice. Barrett wiped his eyes, unable to stop the tears. They were led away in handcuffs, no longer symbols of power, but of consequence. Watching silently from the gallery was Nathaniel Cross. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, softly, solemnly, Justice had been served. Painful, long overdue, but served nonetheless. That afternoon, golden sunlight filtered through the wide windows of the director's office at FBI headquarters in Haverford. Nathaniel stood by the glass, gazing down at the city, the buzz of traffic flowing past Constitution Avenue far below. Months had passed since the trial. The headlines had faded, but the memory hadn't. The public had called it a victory, a landmark moment, a turning point. But for Nathaniel, the feeling was more complicated. Yes, the system had worked, this time, but deep down, he knew why. It wasn't because the facts had been so overwhelming. It wasn't because justice had finally opened its eyes. It was because he was who he was, because he held the title of Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because his voice, unlike so many others, had weight, because the cameras listened when he spoke, and that realization stung more than any insult ever could. What if he had just been another black man in a suit, traveling alone? What if there hadn't been headlines, body cams, public outrage? Would the investigation have even happened? Would anyone have cared? Would he have been just another story that never made it past a brief report? Or worse, ignored altogether? The answer hovered in his mind like an unwanted truth. Probably not. What happened at Baystone International had been more than personal. It was a window into something far more painful and persistent. The quiet, brutal normalcy of racial profiling. The silent abuse woven into the seams of justice itself. He had seen it. He had lived it. And for one moment, he had been part of the crowd, not above it. That's why this couldn't end in a courtroom. That's why the real fight had only just begun. Nathaniel turned away from the window and returned to his desk, cluttered with briefings on organized crime, cyber threats, and homeland security. But atop those files lay a smaller one marked internal reform, oversight, and accountability. He picked it up, flipped it open, and read for a moment. His expression was calm, focused, determined. He knew his job now wasn't just to lead the FBI, it was to reform it, to clean out the rot, to set the example for every department, every officer, every leader watching. Because justice, real justice, doesn't depend on rank or title or reputation. It must reach every citizen, regardless of color, status, or power. And as long as that wasn't true, his work would never be done. He sat back in his chair, the soft hum of Washington drifting in from beyond the glass. His hands rested lightly on the file. His gaze was steady. Nathaniel Cross would carry on. Not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of duty, to make sure that what happened to him would never be just another news cycle, never again a name forgotten, never again a case dismissed. He would carry the weight of his story and turn it into something bigger. Because in a just society, true justice should never depend on who you are.